I never imagined university could be so scary. I was at the University of Vermont during winter break, alone in the dorm, enjoying the peace. Most of the students had gone home, and I, for some reason, decided to stay. It was my decision. I liked the tranquility that the empty campus provided. That afternoon, after a bit of studying, I decided to take a quick walk to the campus cafeteria. The blizzard was strong, the wind biting my face, but nothing major. It even seemed kind of cozy, one of those winter landscapes that seem like something out of a movie. When I got back to my dorm, it was completely covered in snow. The building was silent, but something bothered me as I walked through the door. I had locked everything before leaving, as I always do, and the first thing I noticed was that the door was slightly ajar. My eyes stayed glued to the crack. That didn't feel right. I ran my hand across my forehead, trying to shake off the feeling of discomfort, but something wasn't right. I went in, but soon I felt that the air was different, heavier, as if someone had just left or was there, watching me. I looked around. Nothing seemed out of place, but I soon noticed small details. The window in my room was open, a little wider than usual, and the curtain, which is always tidy, was a bit messy, as if it had been pulled. My heart accelerated. I walked past the living room and came across something that made me stop in my tracks. There were clothes in my closet. They weren't mine. I looked at those clothes for a long time, as if I wanted to believe I was imagining things. But it wasn't possible. I knew exactly what was there. The clothes were of a very specific type. A winter coat that I had never seen in my life, along with dark sweatpants that weren't mine. I was freezing, but I didn't know if it was from the cold or panic. My body was on alert, but I didn't want to admit that someone was there, in my dorm. I ran my hand over my cell phone, which was on the table, but the emergency message I wanted to send wasn't coming. I wanted to call someone, but I was afraid of making noise. I didn't know what could be happening. I took a deep breath and went into the hallway, trying to see what else was out of place. The silence was absolute, but the feeling of presence was there, squeezing my chest. That's when I realized there was something else strange. The kitchen light was on, and I was sure I had turned it off before leaving. When I approached the kitchen door, I saw the shadow of something moving on the wall, but when I opened it, there was no one. The feeling that something was wrong intensified with every second. The worst part wasn't the fact that someone had entered the building, but the fact that they were there watching me, or worse, waiting for the right moment to act. I was alone in the hallway now, and the place seemed to have become even emptier and colder, as if it had been stripped of any life. The thought that someone was watching me at that moment made me even more tense. I could no longer trust what I saw around me. I decided to check everything, every corner of the dorm, every closet, every drawer. I had to find something that would explain what was happening, even though I knew nothing was going to make sense. The problem was that the more I looked, the more I felt like I was moving away from my own sanity. That place, which until then was safe and familiar, was starting to turn into a nightmare. The feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. It was as if I were being swallowed by the darkness of that building. The worst part is that there was no one to ask for help. I looked out the window and saw the snow falling heavily. It was dark outside, but inside, the tension seemed to increase. When I entered my room again, the sound of the wind outside seemed to have become more intense, and I could almost swear I heard scratching coming from outside the door. It was at that moment that I noticed that my closet door was slightly open. I had closed that door before leaving, I'm sure of it. My heart raced again. I opened the door slowly, expecting the worst, but nothing, just my clothes. However, underneath my things, there was something that wasn't mine. A small black backpack, very compact. I took it with a shaking hand, trying not to make any noise. Inside the backpack, there was a crumpled piece of paper. My head was full of questions, but I didn't want to know the answer. I simply unrolled the paper, and when I read it, panic took over me in an even more overwhelming way. It said in scribbled letters, "I'm right next to you." I don't know how, but at that moment I knew. I was no longer alone. I tried to calm down, take a deep breath, but dread was taking over me. That paper, that message, what did it mean? I looked around the room, as if somehow the answer was there. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. I ran to the door, locking it with the key. The building was silent except for the sound of the storm outside, which now sounded like a roar, as if the world itself was trying to warn me of something. I stood still, not knowing what to do. I wanted to call someone, but the words wouldn't come out of my mouth. When I finally got it, the cell phone vibrated. I almost got scared, but when I looked, I saw that it was a text message, a notification from a friend who asked me if I was okay. Before I could respond, another message appeared, coming from an unknown number. It was just a photo. I tapped the screen, and the image appeared. It was my dorm door, a photo taken outside, right where I was. I froze. My fingers no longer responded. The photo had not been taken by me, but by someone who was right there, in the hallway. The unknown number sent another message shortly afterwards, saying, "You're not leaving here." I couldn't think anymore. I looked out the window again, hoping to see something in the street, but the storm was blinding me. Fear spread throughout my body, and the only thing I knew was that I was no longer safe. I wanted to run away, but how? What was happening? The presence in the building was already overwhelming me, and I no longer knew where the line was between reality and what my mind was creating. I didn't know what to do. Every step I took seemed to take me further away from any notion of safety. My body was paralyzed by fear, but something inside me was still trying to find a solution. I took a deep breath and decided to check the exits. Maybe I could run away. Maybe someone on the street could help me. The idea of staying inside the dormitory seemed increasingly unbearable. When I carefully opened my bedroom door again, a cold feeling settled in my bones. The darkness in the hallway seemed thicker, and I instinctively hid behind the wall, listening for any sound. No movement, no breathing, but suddenly a noise, slow, low, as if something was being dragged. I looked down the hall where the kitchen light was still on. The sound was coming from there. I was paralyzed, trying to understand what was happening. The noise was increasing, as if something was moving to meet me. Panic spread through my body, and I took a step back, not wanting to make a sound. The sound continued, closer. My eyes were fixed on the kitchen door, but I couldn't move anymore. I just wanted time to pass, for something to happen, for the nightmare to stop. It was then that the kitchen door slowly opened. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the storm. Something was there. I saw the silhouette in a way I can't explain. The image was quick but intense. Something human, but at the same time it wasn't. I knew I was being watched again, and this time the feeling was even stronger. There was no longer any doubt that someone was inside the building with me. I was no longer alone. And as much as I tried to convince myself that it wasn't real, my body knew otherwise. The fear was so deep that my legs didn't respond. Just then, the figure disappeared from the door, and silence took over everything again. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body was completely paralyzed. Fear took over every inch of my being. I was in a state of total alert, waiting for the figure to appear again, or worse, for someone to come find me. The silence was so heavy it was like it was trying to swallow me. I could no longer trust my perceptions. Maybe it was the stress of the blizzard or the loneliness of recess, but I knew I wasn't making it up. I could feel it, The thing was there, watching my every move. I looked at the clock. I didn't know how much time had passed, but it was already late. The storm outside seemed to have grown more intense, and snow covered every corner of the window. I decided to do something. I got up, deciding to go to the exit and run to the building next door, where I knew there were people. I no longer had a choice, but as he crossed the hallway, the front door suddenly opened. My body froze. The door opened with a bang, as if someone was trying to surprise me. But there was no one, no silhouette, nothing. I, trembling, looked inside. The air was freezing, and what terrified me even more was seeing that the clothes in the closet were gone. The black backpack was also gone. I didn't know what was happening, but something inside me understood. Something was already gone, but the feeling that the presence was still there, in the empty corridors, didn't leave me. I ran to the exit, and when I opened the door, the blizzard swallowed me, with everything that was happening inside. Like a snowstorm that erases everything, that nightmare disappeared as suddenly as it had begun. And to this day, I don't know what happened. All I know is that when I looked at the empty building afterwards, I never went back to my dorm. Something still tells me that if I had gone back, I might have found much more than I expected. It's been almost a year, but I still get chills every time I remember that night in the cabin. My wife Sarah and I decided to go on a romantic trip in January last year. We wanted a secluded place to relax and enjoy some time alone. We ended up finding a super cozy cabin in the Adirondack Mountains for a very reasonable price. Now I know why. The place was beautiful, I won't deny it. It had an incredible view of the snow-covered forest, an old fireplace, and that rustic atmosphere that we wanted so much. We got there around 3 p.m., and the caretaker only showed up quickly to hand over the keys and give some basic instructions about the heater and fireplace. He seemed a little strange and rushed, but at the time I didn't think much of it. The forecast was for heavy snowfall for the night, so he just asked us to stock up on plenty of firewood and make sure we had enough food if we were stuck for a few days. The afternoon passed peacefully. We organized our things, lit the fireplace, and made a simple dinner. Around 8 p.m., the snowfall started in earnest. The wind was blowing hard against the windows, and you could hear tree branches snapping outside. Sarah was super excited about the weather, taking photos of the snow outside the window and talking about how perfect it was for our romantic getaway. I was relaxed too, drinking wine and enjoying the moment. But around 10 p.m., when we were watching a movie under the covers in the living room, I heard a different noise coming from outside. At first I thought it was just the wind, but there was something strange. It was as if someone was walking in the snow, that sound of footsteps slowly sinking. Sarah also noticed and squeezed my hand tightly. We remained in absolute silence, trying to understand what was happening. The sound stopped for a few minutes, and I tried to convince Sarah that it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something. But deep down I knew those steps were different, heavier, and methodical. I decided to get up and take a look out the front window, even though Sarah begged me not to. When I pulled back the curtain, my blood ran cold. There were footprints in the snow, recent human footprints forming a path that led from the forest towards the cabin. The snow was still falling heavily, but it was clear that someone had passed by just a few minutes ago. The worst part was that the footprints wouldn't go away. They kept going around the side of the cabin. My hands started to shake as I realized I needed to check the other windows. Sarah was almost crying, but decided to come with me. We went from room to room, checking each window with our cell phone flashlight. The footprints followed a pattern, as if someone was circling the cabin, stopping at each window for a few moments. When we got to the room, our hearts almost stopped. There, in the accumulated snow right in front of the window, were deeper marks, as if the person had stood still for a long time, watching. And the worst part, You could clearly see the fingerprints on the fogged glass outside. Sarah started to panic and I tried to stay calm, but it was difficult. I took out my cell phone to call the police, but of course, there was no signal at all. The blizzard must have taken down the towers. The cabin's landline phone didn't work either. I started locking all the doors and windows, pushing furniture against the entrances. The whole time I was thinking about how long that person could have been watching us, what they wanted, and why they chose our cabin. Sarah remembered that she had seen some figures earlier through the kitchen window, but thought it was just a reflection of the falling snow. Now everything made macabre sense. We locked ourselves in the bedroom, which was the safest room in the house, and I took a poker from the fireplace to use as a weapon if I needed to. Suddenly, we heard footsteps on the front porch. Slow, shuffling steps, as if the person doesn't care about making noise right now. The creaking of old wood made it clear that someone was walking outside, stopping at each window. Sarah hugged me tight when the footsteps came to our window. The curtain was closed, but I could see a shadow outside, standing there. We sat in absolute silence, barely breathing, as we heard the soft sound of scratching on the glass. It was as if the person was drawing something with their fingertip. After a few minutes that seemed like an eternity, the footsteps began to slowly move away. In my desperation of trying to understand what was happening, I noticed that Sarah wouldn't let go of her cell phone, desperately trying to get a signal. She was shaking so much that she could barely hold the device. That's when we noticed something even more disturbing. There were other, older footprints in the snow, partially covered by the recent snowfall. This meant that the person had been watching us for much longer, probably since we arrived. I kept thinking about the janitor and his strange behavior. Did he know something? Had this already happened before? My head was spinning with theories as I tried to stay sane and protect my wife, who was now huddled in the corner of the room, hugging her knees. Around 2 a.m., the sounds outside changed. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. We started to hear something like whispers or murmurs coming from different directions. It was impossible to understand what they were saying, but there seemed to be more than one voice. Sarah began to cry softly when we realized that the voices were getting closer and closer to the windows. Panic took over when we noticed that the shadows outside had also multiplied. It was no longer just one person. Now it appeared to be 3 or 4 figures moving around the cabin. I gripped the poker so hard my fingers went numb as I watched in horror as the shadows danced across the walls, cast by the moonlight piercing the snow. The following hours were a nightmare of pure tension. The figures continued to circle the cabin, sometimes stopping, sometimes moving quickly. At times they would disappear completely, and this silence was even worse. We didn't know where they were or what they were planning. Sarah had found a small digital camera in her bag and began taking shaky photos through the crack in the curtain, hoping to get some proof of what was happening. I knew it was risky, but I also wanted to make sure we weren't going crazy. When she looked at the photos, she almost dropped the camera. In one of them, you could clearly see a hooded figure standing right in front of the window, staring directly into the lens. At one point, we heard something even more frightening. The sound of someone trying to open the back door. It wasn't an aggressive attempt, it was methodical, as if the person was testing different ways of unlocking the door. The sound of the slowly turning doorknob was like psychological torture. We stood frozen, listening to that sound for several minutes, until it suddenly stopped. Soon after, we started to hear the same thing at other entrances to the house. They were systematically testing every door, every window, looking for a way in. Sarah squeezed my hand so hard that her nails left marks on my fingers. Time passed absurdly slowly as we waited, terrified, for what would happen next. At around 4 a.m., something inexplicable happened. The sounds began to gradually fade away, as if people were moving away. At first we thought it was just another trick, so we remained motionless, barely breathing. But after about 20 minutes of total silence, I found the courage to look out the window. The footprints were still there, but there was no one else in sight. The blizzard had eased and the moon was shining enough for me to be sure we were alone again. Even so, we remained locked in the room until the sun rose, around 7 a.m. Only then did I have the courage to go out and check the rest of the house. Nothing had been stolen or disturbed, but we found something disturbing. On every window in the house, there were different finger drawings made in the condensation outside symbols I had never seen before, which looked ancient. As soon as the day was completely clear, we threw our things in the car and got out of there as quickly as possible. On the way, we tried calling the caretaker several times, but he never answered. After much insistence, the rental agency told us that similar cases had already happened in that region, but they refused to give more details. Sarah developed the digital camera photos as soon as we got home, but inexplicably, all the images of the hooded figures were completely blurred, as if there had been some kind of interference. Only the footprints in the snow were clearly visible. To this day, we still don't know how to explain what happened that night. I try to convince myself that it was just people trying to scare us, but there's something about those symbols on the windows and those whispers that don't make sense. Sarah refuses to talk about it and has thrown away all the photos. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, when I hear the wind hitting our apartment window, that terror comes back with a vengeance. And I always double-check if anyone is watching me outside. My friend Lucas and I have always been the adventurous type, those who love exploring isolated and peaceful places. So we decided to go hiking in Glacier National Park in Montana during the winter. The idea was to enjoy the snow-covered landscape and the tranquility that this type of place provides. We never imagined that it would become one of the worst nightmares of our lives. The trail was relatively well known, but it was quite far from everything, which gave us that good feeling of being disconnected from the world. The snow fell heavily, the wind cut our faces, but the beauty was so immense that, at first, we thought of nothing other than enjoying that moment. The cold air and stillness of the forest were almost therapeutic. It happened when we stopped for a moment to look at the map, trying to decide which way to go. It was then that Lucas called me. He was pointing at the ground, with the expression of someone who had seen something very strange. I crouched down beside him and saw the footprints in the snow. They were big, looked recent, and didn't belong to any of us. They were much wider, with the traces of heavy boots, and the strangest thing, they seemed to have been left by someone with bigger steps than ours. The first thing I thought was that maybe someone had passed by there before, but I soon realized that these marks were much closer than anyone would have been able to do in such a short time. And for some reason, a chill went up my spine. The feeling of being watched was already there, and the sight of those footprints only made it worse. We remained silent for a while, observing those marks, not knowing what to think. Lucas was the first to break the silence, suggesting that it was probably some other group that was there before us, and that there was no way of knowing who those footprints were. He tried to rationalize, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. After a few minutes, we decided to move on. We didn't know if that had been a distraction or a warning, but it seemed like there was nothing left to do but continue. The trail was still visible, despite the heavy snow, and with each step, the wind increased, making it difficult for us to see. The feeling of being followed grew stronger as we advanced. With every snap of a branch, with every movement in the forest, I felt that someone or something was there watching us. The blizzard started to get stronger, visibility was almost zero, and the environment seemed increasingly oppressive. I had the strange feeling that time was passing more slowly, as if we were trapped in that place, unable to get out. Sometimes I would look back, hoping to see the path clear and the trail behind us, but each time I did, I saw nothing but a white curtain of snow. I knew we had to go back, but something was stopping me. The feeling that someone was following us was undeniable. It wasn't just an impression. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind us, but whenever we looked, there was no one. The trees seemed increasingly closed, and the sound of falling snow was the only thing that broke the silence. And the further we went, the more the feeling of not being alone intensified. The situation was starting to become unsustainable. The snowfall was so heavy that we could no longer see the trail signs. I felt lost, as if the forest had swallowed us and left us there, alone, with no way out. Lucas and I started walking faster, but with each step the weight of the snow became more difficult to bear. The sound of footsteps behind us also continued, but the strangest thing is that, whenever we looked back, the snow seemed clean, as if no one was there. This left me with a growing sense of panic, and I could no longer think straight. Tension was in the air, and the idea that we had been followed began to transform into something more concrete, more threatening. I couldn't control my breathing anymore, and Lucas was equally scared. He told me that we were going in the wrong direction, that we had to turn back soon before it got even more dangerous, but there was something in me that told me not to look back, not to pay attention to it. And it was at that moment that the most bizarre thing happened. I heard a noise coming from one side of the forest, something like a crack, followed by heavy footsteps, and then, just in the corner of my vision, a shadow moving quickly through the trees. I froze. Whatever it was there, as close as the sound of our own footsteps, but the snow around it was intact, as if that shadow left no mark. I almost couldn't breathe, and Lucas immediately noticed my panic. He turned to me, asking what I was looking at, but I couldn't answer. The fear was so great that it swallowed me. The feeling that we were no longer alone became so real that it felt like the forest was surrounding us, slowly swallowing us. We decided to stop for a moment, trying to gather our strength and think of a solution. I was starting to panic, but I knew I couldn't show it to Lucas. The snow was falling more and more, the wind was sharp, and the silence was profound. The strangest thing of all was the feeling that the forest seemed alive. It was as if the trees, the branches, the ground itself were somehow reacting to our presence, as if something was watching us from all sides. Every noise, no matter how slight, made my heart beat faster. The sound of our footsteps in the snow mixed with something else, something strange, as if they were imitating our movement. I knew I couldn't trust my senses anymore, but still, the feeling of being followed wouldn't go away. On the contrary, it seemed like the thing that was chasing us was getting closer and closer. The tension was unbearable. When we finally decided to turn back, we were hit by a gust of wind so strong we could barely stand. It was as if nature was turning against us, forcing us to continue to an unknown place. Every direction felt wrong, and with every step, fear turned to dread. It was then that we heard clearly, for the first time, the sound of footsteps behind us. It wasn't just the snaps of branches breaking or the sound of the wind. It was someone or something with heavy and steady footsteps that were getting closer every second. Lucas looked back and almost freaked out. He saw a figure, a shadow, in the periphery of his vision. But when we turned around, there was nothing again. There were no footprints, no marks in the snow, just silence. I had never experienced anything so distressing in my life. At this moment, the blizzard seemed to swallow the entire world. Visibility was so bad that we could no longer see a foot ahead, and the feeling of being completely isolated and lost was taking over me. The only thing I knew was that the figure we were seeing, or actually that seemed to see us, was standing there watching us silently. It was as if we were trapped. I no longer knew what was real and what was an illusion caused by fear. The wind continued to rise, cutting into the face, and the cold became more and more intense. The feeling of being followed grew so much that we could barely move calmly. Every step seemed to bring us closer to whatever was hunting us, and every snap of a branch, every whisper in the wind, only fueled the paranoia. That was when the situation reached its peak. Lucas and I decided to stop trying to get back, as it seemed like we weren't going anywhere. It was a difficult decision, but we no longer had the strength to continue walking. We tried to seek shelter among some large trees, hoping that if we stayed put for a while the worst would pass. The fear of continuing the walk seemed greater than that of staying there, in the cold and darkness. But before we could do anything, the silence was broken by a sound so clear and terrifying that it made me freeze with terror. A sigh, such a heavy sigh, as if someone had exhaled right next to us. I looked at Lucas, but he looked just as scared as I felt. The feeling that something was there all around us was overwhelming. And then, everything stopped. The sound, the snowfall, the movement. We stood there in complete silence, waiting for something that never happened. And that's how it turned out. Whatever was following us, whatever that invisible presence was, disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. We stood, frozen, not knowing if we were still being watched or if we were finally alone. The wind stopped at once, the snow fell more slowly, and the forest calmed strangely, as if it had ceased to be a threat. Lucas was just as in shock as I was, not knowing what to do or what to think. The only thing we could do was look at each other, speechless. For a long moment, it seemed like we were in one of those horror movies, where the danger disappears without any explanation, leaving the characters there without understanding what really happened. But this wasn't a movie. It was real, and we didn't know how to deal with that. When we finally managed to find a landmark to leave, the feeling of relief was almost immediate, but the fear was still there, hanging in the air. We managed to get to the point where the road became more visible, but deep down we knew that nothing would have been the same as before. That day in the forest would never leave my mind again. The feeling that someone or something followed us throughout the walk never left me, and the worst, the fear that it could return. To this day, I don't know what it was. Maybe some other human being lost there, maybe something much stranger. I just know that the feeling of not being alone was very real, and that somehow still haunts me. That day in Glacier Park was the most disturbing day of my life, and the truth is that to this day I still can't understand what happened. And really, we never talked much about that day again. Time passed, things took their course, but that experience still haunts me, without explanation, without answers. When I remember everything that happened that day, the footprints, the feeling of being followed, the shadow moving through the trees, a part of me still can't believe it was real. The other part, however, knows that it was not something that my mind alone created. I don't know if someone was really there, or if something was hunting us, but I feel like I'll never be completely free of that feeling of terror. And worst of all, I never knew how it started, much less why it stopped. As if, out of nowhere, it had simply ended. The silence returned, but the fear remained. I could never stop wondering, what or who was there, and what did they want from us?